We'd like to welcome you to our class this afternoon on some special cases in biblical counseling. And Ken Burford and I'm Sam Laing, are going to be teaching the class today. Let me mention just a couple of things as far as preliminaries, and we're going to get right into the class. We are dealing with what Ken and I have tried to discern are some of the more difficult things you would face in your ministry, in counseling. I know there probably be some areas that we do not cover or don't have time to cover adequately. We'll perhaps be able to take some questions at the end on some of these other areas. So we've selected out several areas that we are going to cover. I'll list those in just a moment. Let me say this also, that we are basically approaching the matter from the idea that you are in the ministry and are dealing with people that are Christians, and that are dealing with people in a situation where you have a church fellowship, where you have body life, you have some support to help you out from other brothers and sisters in Christ as far as friendships and so forth that are available to people. You have preaching and teaching going on that would help them in other ways than simply meeting with you and in a context of Christian commitment. So let's sort of lay those preliminaries, and I realize that some of you may not be in that situation, but we tried to adjust the class in order to meet the needs that we thought or the situations that are faced by people that would be in the class today, and that's sort of the way we've developed it. Let me mention the different areas we're going to be covering. Ken and I are going to each have primary responsibility for one area, and then the other teacher will have the freedom to come in at any time and make any comments. And try to save your comments for the end, and we'll take some questions towards the end of class. But here are the areas. Strong parental resistance to Christian commitment. Strong parental resistance to Christian commitment. Conflict and resentment in relationships. Homosexuality. Masturbation. Frustration. Defeat. Lack of motivation in Christian life. And then towards the end, if we have time, we'll deal with out of the ordinary or bizarre behavior, suicide. Those main areas we'll be dealing with today, and without any further introduction, Ken is going to be coming. Let me say this, that we are going to speak frankly about these things. That's the only way we know how to do it, and we appreciate the maturity of the audience here today and those who are attending the class, and that's the assumption we have about you, and that we hope that you will be able to accept that as we teach the class. Thank you.
This is about a 3-hour counseling workshop crammed into 1 hour, which is totally impossible to do. Hopefully, what we'll be able to share are some things that will help you and maybe stimulate your own thinking, because that's really what has to take place ultimately. And that what we're saying are, as much as anything else, an area of some suggestions and some things that we've learned through our own experiences. I'm going to begin by talking about helping Christians, especially young converts whose parents are hostile to the commitment that they've made as a Christian. There are a couple of ways in which this is extremely important to us in our ministries. One, because here's an area that can really be a factor in people falling away. I've seen people fall away because of parental hostility. I don't think that's the only reason, but it was certainly a major factor. And also, many of us have learned that this is an area that can be extremely crucial to your ministry. And if you've got some people that are messing this one up, you may find yourself in deep trouble some particular time. As far as some specifics, one, just to mention already in the context that Sam did, a lot of this particular area, as well as some of these others, needs to be dealt with on an ongoing basis in the general teaching that you're doing in your ministry. The kinds of things you share in classes, the kinds of things that you share in devotionals, a lot of these things can be introduced in that kind of context to eliminate as much specific counseling as except for that is absolutely crucial and necessary. In counseling, here's some things that are important in this particular area. One, and really this is true in all areas, is always get the facts. Find out as much as you possibly can what is actually going on, what has occurred. Find out the reasons for the hostility in the parents. There can be a lot of different reasons. You may be talking about parents who are Christians, who maybe have been in a situation where they don't understand some of the enthusiasm, some of the commitments that their particular son or daughter has. Sometimes you're talking about on the other extreme, parents that are really worldly, just really pagan-minded. that are hostile philosophically to Christianity, that are hostile to the kind of commitment that they see in their particular son or daughter. One thing I think we need to realize, and maybe sometimes we fail to do this, is that the hostility in the parents may be the fault of your counselee. It may be the fault of the Christian in this situation. There's a proverb in Proverbs 18 that says you need to get the facts from both sides before you arrive at a judgment. And I think sometimes I've seen situations where it was very easy to jump on the side of the young Christian convert there, when really a major part, if not all, the hostility on his or her parents' part was really due to mistakes that the individual had made. Many times there are extremes in an individual's response. Sometimes they're totally afraid to tell their parents that they've made a commitment as a Christian. Sometimes, on the other hand, they want to go in with their Bible blazing to really blow them away. Either, their parents are Christians and they really haven't been committed and they need to tell mom and dad to repent, or their parents, are not Christians and they, go in and blow them away and tell them to repent of their pagan attitudes and that sort of thing. And both really present real problems. One thing that has to be dealt with when parents are not Christians is the issue of the parent not being a Christian. And that's something that is best dealt with before someone's baptized. Now then, I try not to go in and tell somebody that their parents are not Christians, but one thing I do is that whenever somebody's been presented the gospel, when somebody comes to the point of believing the gospel, is to ask them, how does this affect other people that you know? How does this relate not only to you, but also to your parents, to other people that you know, friends, and so forth? Sometimes this issue can resurface after the person's been home for a break or something like that, or especially after a death in the family, the death of a grandparent. I've seen some young Christians really blown away because of maybe the death of a grandparent, or even in extreme cases of a parent. And there's a lot of question there where they start to re-examine this, and that is something to be aware of, that person may not come to you for counseling, but there may be a person in that situation who really needs counseling because they're really struggling with these issues. Has my grandparent died and gone to hell? Has my mother or my father died and gone to hell? Or my parents are upset with me because they think I think granddad's in hell, or that kind of thing. And you got to really deal with that in a compassionate way, in a way that's going to help this young Christian be able to handle that. One thing that I always teach in counseling in a teaching type situation to a group is 1 Peter chapter 3, where Peter tells wives to win their unbelieving husbands without a word by the purity, the reverence of their lives. And I believe that applies equally to children. And that's something I try to impress. And really, you're a child of your parents regardless of your own particular chronological age. That applies to every person in relationship to their parents. In terms of helping a person deal with fear when they're simply afraid to tell their parents, usually you can explain to an individual that it's better to be open. Sooner or later, you're going to have to be open. Better be open now, better be open immediately than be guilty of concealing something, because that lack of trust can really cause a breakdown in the relationship. One thing is to get that person help from another peer who's gone through the same thing. In your ministry, there are other brothers, there are other sisters who've gone through the same thing, some who've made mistakes and have worked them out, some who've handled it well from the beginning. Get that person some peer help from someone that's been through it. Cite positive examples of individuals in your ministry or other ministries where a parent has eventually been converted. We have parents who've been converted because of the right behavior of their children. One thing I think is very important, that if you can possibly do so, get in touch with a parent and always maintain an attitude of openness in your life and in your ministry. That your life, that your ministry, that your congregation is one that is totally open to someone checking out at all times. And sometimes I've had the opportunity to sit down and talk with parents, in some cases non-Christian parents. And that's where sometimes you find out that maybe the son or daughter isn't exactly acting the way he or she needs to be acting. And it's really beneficial. I think every time that I've had an opportunity to talk with a parent, that it's been a positive situation. Not that it's always resolved the situation, but I think it's always at least made some progress. There's an individual, there's a man who lives in Massachusetts, east of Boston, whose daughter was converted in our ministry a few years ago. And he came down to visit us. He was really concerned what kind of a weirdo kind of church situation that his daughter was involved in. And he came to church, he came to worship, he came to the Bible classes. We had lunch together. and we talked. And I know he doesn't theologically agree with me. I know there are a lot of disagreements that we have, but I believe that we were able to establish a mutual respect for one another that helped in that kind of situation. So it really helps when you can talk to the parents. I remember a situation where a father in the Phoenix area was really upset with his son. I got together with him along with one of the elders, and we talked out the situation, and it really helped. When it came down to it, the number one thing that the father was really upset about was that his son was doing a lousy job in school. And so basically, we turned to the son and talked to him about the fact he was doing a lousy job in school and he needed to get on the stick, be a better student. And that helped to resolve that situation and made a much better relationship. Here's some things that students can do. One, they can improve their studies. Many times parents are concerned about their children's studies. And I've seen situations where when the students' grades improved, the parents' hostility went down. Sometimes parents are upset because the children are not sure on, especially when they're college students, what their career is going to be. And you've got a student out there that's floating and they're really having troubles making a career choice. And if you can help them in that, sometimes that'll help that parental relationship. Sometimes students need to learn how to communicate love to their parents. To understand that maybe if you've rejected the parents' religion, you've rejected the parents' lifestyle, that the parents themselves feel personally rejected. If you can help the parent or the student to understand their parents and learn how to communicate love to them and acceptance to them, that's extremely important. Something that's really vital in this area is in counseling someone, is to let the individual decide exactly what to do. You help a person work through their alternatives, what they might possibly do, how they might possibly handle a situation, but you let them decide. Sometimes they want you to tell them exactly what to do, exactly what to say, everything. And you've got to help them be wise in making their own decisions and make sure that they understand it's their decision and not something that you're telling them or making them do. You can help them by role-playing with them, presenting them a situation. Sometimes a student is just totally too optimistic about how their a parent may respond. And sometimes you have to say, but what if they respond this way? What if they don't respond that way? How will you handle it then? To really try to prepare them to handle the situations that they may be facing. And then finally, to realize that sometimes you're maybe talking to an individual who may be guilty of resentment toward parents. And I just want to run through this quickly because Sam's going to be talking about conflict and resentment. But sometimes you're talking about an individual who's become a Christian, and when they did, they were harboring resentment against their parents, and they still do. And sometimes you don't realize that at first because that's something many times is very hard to admit. Very hard for a young person to admit that they have bitter feelings, resentment toward parents, but that is very often the case, and you need to really explore that possibility. Find out about their relationship. Get them to talk about their relationship that they had with their father, that they had with their mother. Find out about their feelings. How did you feel about that? How did you feel about that relationship? To detect any possible bitterness, resentment that may be there so that can be brought out, surfaced, and dealt with. And then once it is, to get them to produce the fruit of repentance, to offer thanks for their parents, to guide to their parents, to look for the positive things in their parents' lives, to go to their parents for advice in areas where they can give advice. I've counseled many brothers to go to their dads for financial advice. Maybe their dad was materialistic, but at least he knew how to manage his money. And I've known a lot of brothers can learn a lot from their dads about managing money. Write to their parents. There's an amazing number of students don't even, write to their parents. Serve them at home. Spend time with them. Learn how to turn an object of conflict into a focal point of outreach. I know a young brother whose stepfather has a yacht. And this yacht is something he literally despised because his stepfather loved his yacht more than he loved the family. At least that was this individual's perception. And I said, look, why don't you just go enjoy spending some time on that yacht with your stepfather? And use that as a tool for reaching out to him. I said, if you don't, I will, I wouldn't mind that so much. I could get into it. So that turns something that you've let become an object of conflict into a focal point of outreach. And then finally, sometimes people just have to be prepared for the reality that sometimes there is going to be hostility that's not going to be resolved. And I won't take time to read it, but read Mark chapter 10, verses 29 following real well, and be able to help your counselee, your brother, your sister, implement that in their particular lives.
I would mention just a couple of other things by way of emphasis. One is to do all we can do to pick up on a situation like this that could happen before it ever happens, and to try to circumvent that by getting to know parents or having other students that are mature and handle themselves very well to go into that person's home and so forth and get to know them. And that really can make a big difference. I think we should look upon the parents' situation as a real opportunity for family evangelism rather than something that's a threat to us. And we should look at it in, I think, the way the church did in the book of Acts, and that is when they reached an entire household. And I think if we have that attitude, parents, other relatives will pick up on that, and that we are positive towards them, and we should be in that way. I think it's important not to overreact to the situation ourselves, and not to get all upset, but to get have a mature assessment of it from our own point of view. And if we sense the student weakening, I think we have to remind them of their commitment to Christ that they made, and that it was their decision to follow Jesus, and it still is. And that it's not our decision for them to continue to follow Jesus. We'll do everything we can do to help them to carry that out, and to back them up, and to believe in them as they work through this situation. I think otherwise I don't really have anything to add, because Ken did such a wonderful job on that. And getting involved, our elders involved in a situation like this, older people, older couples in the congregation, can really help and make a big difference. To have people like this in the congregation reach out to some parents, and even maybe if they live in another community and 3 states away, there may be some brothers and sisters there that could help with the situation, because sometimes it's the fear of the unknown that may cause parents to react this way, and perhaps we could even identify with that fear, recognizing that ultimately sometimes, even then, we cannot, as Ken pointed out, prevent some sort of conflict taking place. I want to talk for a few minutes about conflict and resentments. I think it's one of the more common problems we face, so in that sense it might be something we might not have on the agenda, but I think so oftentimes we don't know how to deal with that when someone comes into us that has had a conflict with another Christian, a roommate, a close brother or sister in Christ, or someone simply in the church that they had a run-in with that they don't know that well, or simply a person that is beset by or eaten up with resentments that perhaps they have carried for a long period of time, or for several days, or for several weeks, or whatever. How do we deal with this? Let me mention just several things. I think it's important to get all the facts concerning any situation of conflict that comes up between individuals or groups in the church. To be careful to get all the background information, to get all the facts. And it's very important, I believe, if you need to go to both sides before you formulate your own judgment on the matter. Ken alluded to this verse earlier, but I wanted to read it because I believe it really applies in resolving conflict between Christians. And it goes this way. In Proverbs 18:13, it says, "He who answers before listening, that is his folly and shame." We need to not form conclusions on anything or anybody before we listen to what somebody's saying to us. And then it says in verse 17, "The first to present his case seems right till another comes forward and questions him." So often, I really heard one side of a story, either in marriage counseling or just in conflict between two Christians, and I was convinced that the other person was a green-eyed troll that was just as mean as a snake. And sometimes maybe that was true, sometimes it was not. To hear the other person tell the story, it was the other way around. And I think we need to have the maturity in counseling people not to overreact or react too soon and get angry ourselves in a situation. We've got to retain objectivity, particularly in resolving conflict. It's easy for us, if we have a propensity to see a certain person or a certain situation the same way all the time, our own weakness may come into play, and we may misjudge somebody or a situation because of our own biases. We've got to be careful not to do that, very careful to get both sides. I think it's very important also to see if a person generally has a problem with resentment as a way of life, that they simply are angry, an angry person. They are angry and probably have been angry for a long, long time, and therefore they simply have a very much of a tendency to get angry with people and to feel that people are down on them, people that have wronged them very easily. Then I think we need to help a person to see that they have that tendency, to see why they have it, to see the reasons in their life that they have it, and begin to deal with the underlying problem of resentment that they carry in their heart, and to realize that this may be something they have to struggle with for a while. When I read a passage like 1 Peter 2, and it says in verse 1, "And as Peter wrote to Christians, saying, Therefore rid yourselves of all malice and deceit, hypocrisy, jealousy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good." These are Christians who he says, now get rid of malice in your life. Get rid of jealousy and slander. There are people who carry jealousy and envy and slander as Christians in their heart. I think it's important to help a person to recognize this as sort of a sin or a weakness that they have a tendency towards, and begin to work through it. Begin to deal with it as an underlying weakness in their life, and to begin to set the mind on things that are above, as it says in Colossians 3, to begin to look for the good in people and in life, to begin to appreciate their own salvation, to begin to realize that God has forgiven them of a lot of things, that they would be lost without the grace of God, and therefore others who have wronged them, either in real or imagined ways, need also to be treated with gentleness, with forgiveness, with an attitude of charity and love, and not with an attitude of I'm going to demand of you my legal rights on every time we relate to each other. I think we have to help a person to see if they just simply carry a resentment problem. Now, what about a person who carries a resentment problem as a background in their life, but then they have a run-in with somebody? How do we deal with that? I think so often we might tend to assume that the person who comes in with the resentment, if we become convinced that they have a resentment problem, is always wrong. They may not be. They may be right. Somebody may have slighted them or hurt them or wounded them in some way, and due to insensitivity or rudeness or a lack of love, I think we need to see that objectively and help them to learn how to go to people and begin to resolve those kinds of things. Send them back to the brother or sister and say, listen, why don't you go and talk to them and tell them that they did or said something that hurt you, and talk this thing out. They may not want to do that. We say, oh no, they won't like it. We've tried before. We never got anywhere. Help them to go with the proper spirit, with the proper attitude, with an attitude of love to resolve it. I think in the spirit of Matthew 18, which we refer to a lot, but I want to read here today, I think so many problems in the church come from unresolved conflicts. And I'm not just talking about marital conflict, but really conflict in the church that has gone unresolved for many years. Verse 15 of Matthew 18 says, if your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault, just between the two of you. A person comes in and says, this guy wronged me. You say, well, listen, what you need to do is go back and talk to him. Show him his fault. You think he's wrong? Now, you need to listen to him or her when they say they think you are wrong too. What does this do? It helps a person begin to come to grips with their resentments and the conflicts they have, rather than withdraw into a shell or become a gossip and go around and tell everybody else in the church what somebody did to them or said to them or didn't do or didn't say that they wanted done or said. It helps them begin to resolve things in a biblical way, in a spirit of love and honesty. You don't go back to blow somebody out of the water. You go back and say, brother, you've hurt my feelings. Sister, you wronged me. I want to talk to you about it. I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I think you did me wrong here. Sit down, learn to solve things. What's going to happen is that those people, if they resolve it on their own, which usually people can, then you've helped two people. You've helped that person who had the resentment to solve their problem, and you helped their brother or sister to become closer to them and realize an area where they could improve in how they relate. So start sending people back to those people rather than just become a garbage can for gossip coming your way. Some people will do that. They don't intend to solve their resentments. They just want to dump them. Make them go back and deal with it. If they say, I've tried, it didn't work, then you go with them. That's the next step. It says, if he will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses. Take another brother or sister or one of the elders or another one of the ministers on the staff to go and say, brother, sister, we got a problem. Let's resolve this thing. And I think that's where most problems can be solved in the first step. And then the ones that are left, the vast majority of them can be resolved in the second step, so that we don't ever have to take the third step, and that is to tell it to the church. And I've seen more problems resolved in that second step when it's faithfully and seriously obeyed. That long-term problems and conflicts between brothers and sisters resolved. Resentments that have weighed a Christian down for years have been removed. That person's just like having the lights turned on in their heart and life. They're joyful again. They're happy again. They're close again with the people that they had resented, and that corrosion that was eating at them has been dealt with, and they have solved and resolved their problems. Ask for forgiveness. Receive forgiveness. Do you forgive me? Yes, I do. It's okay now. No more feelings? No, we're going to deal with this. We're going to work through it. Okay. See, that's where you as a counselor can get people together and help resolve things. Secure reconciliation and forgiveness in relationships where there's been conflict. I think sometimes, of course, conflict may not be able to be dealt with in that way. Something happened 10, 20, 30 years ago, and there's so many things that have happened to a person, they're just going to have to make up their mind to deal with it within their own heart. The Bible says love covers a multitude of sins. And it says that in 1 Peter 4:8. I think sometimes we just make up our mind we're going to forgive and forget without having to resolve every little conflict that comes our way. But for a while, a person that's not been dealing with conflict successfully may need to go ahead and deal with some that seem awfully petty. Sometimes people that have resentments are afraid that the person that they're taking it back to will just laugh at them and say, oh, that's so trite of you and so selfish of you to bring that up. It may be, but it may help them to work through it so that they see that maybe they did overreact to it. And it'd be better to go ahead and deal with it and begin to resolve some of this so they have a background then not to overreact in the future when someone they think has slighted them or hurt them in some way. Some other scriptures to look at on that would be Hebrews 12, verses 14 and 15, that talk about the root of bitterness. I think spotting that in somebody and helping them to deal with it is very important. I want to give you an example from my own counseling. I had a girl who I felt, it took me a while to see it. I think that I made a mistake in counseling. I said some things that offended her, and that's maybe necessary sometimes in counseling, but in this case, I was in the wrong. Now, she overreacted, and she provoked it in some ways, but I was in the wrong, and she really felt this very strongly, that I had done her wrong. And I saw that she had a resentment problem, and I was trying to make her deal with that. I began to realize, though, I can't make her deal with that until I deal with the mistake I made, and not downplay that, but ask for and secure her forgiveness. So I did that. I said, would you please forgive me? I was wrong for what I said and the way I came across. Would you forgive me? And she looked at me like, what did you say? And the problem is all her life, you see, she'd had a problem relating to anybody that she respected or anybody in authority, from her parents on all the way through school teachers to ministers to elders. And she just built up a tremendous resentment against people like this in her life. I think maybe for the first time somebody in that situation asked her for forgiveness and admitted wrong. She said, well, sure I do. Well, yeah. And she was then able to deal with that. She said, well, I want you to know how much you hurt me, though. I said, I know I did. And I know in some ways I can't know how much I hurt you because I'm not you, but I'm sorry for any hurt that I did cause. And my feeling, I guess, at first was don't do that because she'll just jump on you and say, yeah, see there, and all you people like you've caused all my problems all my life. Well, she didn't do that. She didn't respond that way. She said, well, I really appreciate that. Incidentally, let me say this on the subject of forgiveness. I think one reason that we don't want to forgive others is we don't want to forgive them until they know how much they've hurt us. I got to thinking about that. If God waited until we knew how bad we hurt Him to forgive us, would any of us be forgiven? No. I understand much more today how much I've hurt God than I did when I initially was baptized into Christ. I'm glad He forgave me just as much then as He does now. And I think this may help us in dealing with an attitude of unforgiveness sometimes that people have in a marriage or an adultery or a situation like this where there's deep resentment, to help people realize this person may not know how much they've hurt you. Could they really know? Could you really know how much you have hurt God to help a person to forgive, genuinely forgive, and let the other person know that they have forgiven them? These are some suggestions I want to make. Ken, maybe you want to add some things here on conflict and resentment resolution. If you have questions, save them for the end, please.
I really don't have anything specifically add in that particular area. Just amen what Sam has said. And what Matthew 18 needs to be plugged into counseling so much more than maybe we're inclined to do, and into the entire life of the church. And that's really what the Lord laid out as far as dealing with those kinds of things. One thing I do want to say that relates to that, and also to anything in terms of counseling, in terms of dealing with our lives, and that is that one thing I've learned that's important is to play your hunches. You may suspect that someone is dealing with resentment, for example, or not dealing with it. They've got it and they're not dealing with it. You know, you may just kind of get a feeling that someone has something against you, or has something against somebody else. I tell you what, if you'll study Proverbs real well, and look for all the topics that are dealt with, but topics that relate to bitterness, resentment, I don't think because of any special spiritual insight or anything like that. I think just by learning the Word and being observant of people, that it's not that difficult to pick up when somebody's carrying bitterness around, when somebody's carrying resentment around. You don't have to be, endowed with spiritual gifts to do that. If you think that someone is, play your hunch. Don't go up and pin them up against the wall and accuse them. You're resentful, aren't you, brother? Repent. But to really begin to get to know that person and find out what's going on in that person's life. Sometimes you get the feeling that somebody's not. I really don't have anything specifically to add in that particular area. Just amen what Sam has said. And what Matthew 18 needs to be plugged into counseling so much more than maybe we're inclined to do, and into the entire life of the church. And that's really what the Lord laid out as far as dealing with those kinds of things. One thing I do want to say that relates to that, and also to anything in terms of counseling, in terms of dealing with our lives, and that is that one thing I've learned that's important is to play your hunches. You may suspect that someone is dealing with resentment, for example, or not dealing with it. They've got it and they're not dealing with it. You may just kind of get a feeling that someone has something against you, or has something against somebody else. I tell you what, if you'll study Proverbs real well, and look for all the topics that are dealt with, but topics that relate to bitterness, resentment, I don't think because of any special spiritual insight or anything like that. I think just by learning the Word and being observant of people, that it's not that difficult to pick up when somebody's carrying bitterness around, when somebody's carrying resentment around. You don't have to be endowed with spiritual gifts to do that. If you think that someone is, play your hunch. Don't go up and pin them up against the wall and accuse them. You're resentful, aren't you, brother? Repent. But to really begin to get to know that person and find out what's going on in that person's life. Sometimes you get the feeling that somebody's not telling you the whole story. And I remember not that long ago there was a brother that was just telling me about some problems he'd been having, and when things start coming, sometimes they start coming rather slowly. And eventually he sort of alluded to the fact that he had sort of dropped in at a couple of bars in the last couple of weeks, and I knew that this individual had a background earlier in his life of some sexual immorality. Now, I wasn't accusing this person of sexual immorality, but I just simply asked him. I said, "Let me ask you a question, brother." I said, I'm not saying this is true. I'm just asking you a question. Do girls play any particular role in the problem that you're having right now? And he looked down. And then eventually looked back up, and he said yes. And then he began to tell what had been going on. And that brother's, still a brother, still serving the Lord today. But he might not have been. He could have kept that hidden. But I just had a hunch. Partly based on what I knew about some things in his past, that he wasn't quite, coming clean, so to speak. He wasn't quite being totally honest. And so I just began to ask him in a very gentle, very loving kind of way, as a brother to a brother. And we got down to some things that were really bugging him. That gets into the next area, which is homosexuality, which is something we need to learn about in terms of how to help people, because it is becoming so prevalent, both among men and women. I think I've seen about as many of each, men and women. One thing I encourage you to do is do your own research. I see that Sam's brought a book with him by Tim LaHaye, What Everyone Should Know About Homosexuality. This particular one I have not read. I've read a book by LaHaye called The Unhappy Gaze, which I think is an excellent book. I think that as far as a single work that I could recommend that you look at, that would be Tim LaHaye, The Unhappy Gaze. And I find that what he says there is very consistent with biblical teaching, very consistent with what I've learned from my own experiences in trying to counsel individuals that were into homosexuality. Some things that are helpful in terms of helping people overcome homosexuality. One, always know exactly what you're dealing with. Sometimes you have to ask some very specific, very sensitive questions. And you just might as well prepare yourself to do that. You're going to have to. This is one area where there's no way around it, I do not believe. Now then, sometimes someone will come in and they will say something to the effect, in so many words, I think I'm homosexual. And that's where you just have to start asking questions. Well, what makes you think that way? You know, have you ever, been involved in a relationship? Have you ever done this? Have you ever done that? And so forth. Sometimes you're talking about somebody who's hardcore, who either is or has been living with someone in a practicing homosexual relationship. A lot of the problems that come up are simply people who think they are homosexual, because with all of the publicity that it's getting, with all the hype in our society about it, there are going to be a lot of people, more and more, I'm convinced, that are going to be disturbed because they have felt some kind of an attraction to a same-sex member, and it bugs them. And there needs to be an openness in your relationship with people that they can come to you and talk about that. Something I think is extremely important, and this really bothers me in our society, is labeling. Labeling as far as, I'm homosexual, he's homosexual, she's homosexual. What is homosexuality, in reality? 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, Paul talks about certain sins. He mentions those who practice homosexuality. He also talks about thieves. He talks about slanderers. He talks about the sexually immoral in a general way, which we'd usually apply to heterosexual relationships. A homosexual is somebody that's practicing homosexuality, that's practicing sexual stimulation and gratification. Sometimes a person thinks that they're homosexual when what they have is they have an admiration, a genuine human admiration for someone of the same sex that has some emotional identification associated with it. And it's not a homosexual thing at all. One particular researcher that I've read says that probably as many as 50% of men in our society have felt some sort of sexual attraction to another man at one time or another. But there are only about 10% who've actually carried through in terms of a physical act of homosexuality. So the number of people that at one time or another have felt something that if they really begin to focus on could be identified in their minds as homosexuality is pretty high. And so that's something that really needs to be dealt with. Here's a situation where we're talking about an area where we really have to learn to hate sin and love the person. And if this is something that repulses you, you need to deal with that so that you can hate the sin and love the person. Because one of the things that it seems to me that people who have been involved in homosexuality feared the most maybe in a counseling situation is rejection, personal rejection. And we really have to learn to hate sin and love the person. But we've got to identify it as sin, and you've got the person who really isn't ready to identify it as sin. It is something that is sinned. It's not something that you are, like you are blue-eyed or brown-eyed or blonde-headed or dark-headed, male or female. That's the propaganda that's in our society. It's something that still remains pretty much, even in the research that people do, is something that is learned. I recommend a book, too, that I read, which had some helpful information by a psychologist, psychiatrist, one in New York named Tripp, T-R-I-P-P, called The Homosexual Matrix. the homosexual matrix. And he talks about many ways that people learn homosexual behavior. And it's astounding, the immense variety of ways that people get into this. But he concludes that people learn it in a wide variety of ways, but regardless of how they learn it, the end product is the same, and it basically takes the same for a person to get out of it, regardless of how they've gotten into it. Something else that's important is a lot of times a person feels like that they're special, that their sin is special, that this is somehow some sin that God can't forgive or can't deal with, and self-pity many times is a big problem. And here's where a person has to look to Christ, has to look to the cross, has to look to the grace of God. Sometimes just in terms of dealing with self-pity and the focus on self is a person needs to be constructively involved in the lives of other people and serving other people. Another thing that's important is to realize that there are no instant solutions. I've found that a lot of times what an individual is looking for is an instant solution. And he or she wants you as a counselor to, sprinkle wiffle dust over their head, and suddenly they'll no longer be attracted to an individual of the same sex. Don't make promises. Don't promise someone that the time will come when they'll never be tempted with this. Sam and I were talking about this yesterday and getting ready for today, that a brother may come in and say, I want you to promise me that I'll be able to get married and I'll be able to have a family and everything will be okay. I'm not going to promise that to someone. And especially I'm not going to promise them that that's something that's going to come quickly, because change in many cases takes time. In most cases, for a person to change who really has been into homosexual thoughts, homosexual activity, is a total restructuring of their lives, because something becomes life-dominating. J. Adams, in his works, has some good things to say about life-dominating sins and total restructuring of one's life. The lifestyle obviously has to be restructured. Not only does a person who's been involved behaviorally in homosexuality have to repent and not do that anymore, many times pornography is a factor. Many times masturbation and sexual fantasy, which Sam will get into, is a factor. One thing I think is important in terms of getting a person to restructure their lifestyle is what has happened is that homosexuality, for the person that's really into it, has become the focal point of their life. And if you turn it around and you try to keep it as the focal point of their life while getting rid of it, it doesn't work that way. The problem tends to perpetuate itself. They've got to learn how to make Christ the focal point of their life. They've got to learn how to avoid situations that can be, as far as being tempted, that kind of thing. Brothers have talked to me, what do you do about gang showers in the dorm? I don't know. You're going to have to sit down with an individual on an individual basis and help that person work out his individual, or in the other case of the woman, her individual situation, and help that person restructure his or her life to be able to overcome the homosexuality. But also to restructure the person's thinking, the mental restructuring. Romans 1, before Paul talks about homosexuality, talks about the futility of their thinking. And that futility of one's thinking is going to have to be resolved. Psalm 119 says, I've laid up thy word in my heart that I might not sin against thee. And a person's going to have to really start learning how to rethink, to lay up God's word in their mind, to be able to deal with this thing. 4 keys that I think are important in conjunction with this, and then we'll conclude this. And there's so much that needs to be said about this. Hopefully this will simply be some things that will help you to do some of your own thinking and own study and research in this particular area. One is that it is, I don't know if it's always the case, but it seems to be generally true that when you're dealing with someone who has really gotten into homosexuality, that you're dealing with someone who is extremely self-centered. I want to read something from a study by Masters and Johnsons on homosexuality. It's in a book called Homosexuality in Perspective. They say that the homosexual is highly subjective, that is a highly subjective involvement, that there is an extreme focus on self, that sex between homosexuals is essentially it's your turn now, it's my turn situation, that it is primarily self-gratification. And by the way, that can be true in marriage and other situations. The whole problem is that there's a wrong attitude towards sex. There's a wrong attitude towards self and a wrong attitude toward other people. They talk about the homosexual relationship being safe and secure because men know what pleases men and women know what turns on women. And that really the only thing that depends on is your partner's voluntary cooperation, and that's one reason why long-term relationships are hardly ever satisfying among homosexuals and accounts for the extreme promiscuity that takes place. There's a wrong perspective on sex. The perspective is that there's pleasure, that there's security for self, rather than the fact that you have been created as a sexual being to give to another person. That you have been made to give to another person. And men have been created to give sexually to the woman in the marriage relationship. The woman has been created to give to the man in the married relationship. That's the way God created us. Sex is something to give, not something to get. And I think that's a perspective that really needs to be worked out, whether you're talking about homosexuality or sexually immoral heterosexual relationships. Secondly, that usually individuals involved in homosexuality are extremely feeling-oriented. It is tough to endure. And you're going to have to really work with someone, stay with someone in the context of counseling, in the context of body life, to help that person endure, because they're so feeling-oriented, it's very easy to just give up, throw in the towel, and quit, and many do. And third, many times, and Laing does a good job of dealing with this, there's resentment, there's blaming. Many times resentment toward parents. Don't buy all the stereotypes about, the dominating mother and all that kind of thing. But many times there have been inadequacies in the parental relationship, and many times there can be resentment. There can be a lot of blaming. If a person buys the idea that this is something that is biological, you can even start blaming God for it. Why is God, on the homosexual's case? Because, after all, God made us this way. That kind of thing. To really explore if those kinds of attitudes are there, because if they're not dealt with, the problem of homosexuality will never be dealt with. And a final thing is that I've found homosexuals, I believe it's Laing, if not Laing, others who've pinpointed this, many times I've found homosexuals to lie a lot. Not necessarily about all things, but about this area, because it's something that has been such a taboo in our society that it's just not the sort of thing that's easy to be open about. And many times there's a lot of lying that takes place. And one thing you have to make clear, and sometimes this can be very painful, is that if you are going to be helped, if you're going to resolve this thing, you have to be absolutely 100% totally honest. And that without absolute honesty, there can be no help. With honesty, there is hope. And give the person hope. You can change. I know people who have changed. I know people who haven't, but I know people who have changed. But they had to go through the pain of being honest to do it. And that takes a tremendous amount of love and a tremendous amount of support on your part to be able to have that kind of relationship where that sort of honesty can be a part of the relationship.
We're going to have to move pretty rapidly here, but let me say a couple of other things. I think one thing in dealing with someone who's struggling with this as a Christian is probably the most important thing is, does the person really want to change? If they really don't want to change, then there's nothing really you can do as far as a continuing counseling relationship. The only thing you could try to do is to show them that they need to make that decision, that they really do want to get out of this. Sometimes a person wants to come to a counselor in order to receive perhaps comfort or help them deal with the feelings they have about it, but not to get out of it. And I think that's important to determine very early. And secondly, to establish good, positive Christian relationships. Help that person in forming some good, positive relationships that have nothing to do or not even in any way involved, or where that type of thing is a part of the relationship, where even perhaps they're not tempted in that direction with another brother or another sister in Christ, so that they have a very good, solid friendship. I think they need to be honest probably with some, maybe one or two other individuals, brothers or sisters besides you, about that, so that they can have a friend that can relate to them in the context of their Christian fellowship, not just a counselor who knows about it. I think you perhaps need to guide them on who that ought to be. Sometimes I've seen people that have this problem want to sort of tell everybody about it, and that is not constructive for them or for others in the fellowship. Do not allow, and really try to avoid a person who is tempted in this area to become overly dependent upon others of the same sex, even though it's not a sexual relationship. That can happen. You need to guide them away from this type of over-dependency on others, that they begin to rely on them rather than really on the Lord for their security and their confidence. Don't allow someone who has this problem to take advantage of Christian love and fellowship and affection in any way. They perhaps may need to limit that in their life if they cannot handle it properly. Develop a positive involvement in the church. Christian families with little children, of families and so forth, where they're around wholesome situations with good, solid Christian homes, other brothers and sisters, wholesome activities. Romans 12:21. In other words, the last verse of Romans 12 teaches that we should overcome evil with good, to fill their life up with good things, and as Ken alluded to, serving others, not just being dominated by I'm going to defend myself against this problem out there. They've got to fill up their life with good, just as anybody dealing with any sin or temptation has to fill up their life with good. Changing of mannerisms, of dress, of things like this that may emanate those kinds of signals to others may need some work. Remind them that temptation is not sin. Struggling with temptation, that temptation is like struggling with any other temptation. It's not sinful to be tempted. What's sinful is to give in to temptation. Help them to realize this. And I want to really hit again. Reassure a person in this situation of your own personal acceptance, your love, of your belief in them, that you care, that whatever they've told you is not in any way cause you to pull back or withdraw from them. It's very, very important. That will make a tremendous difference for someone struggling with this, because Romans 1 teaches of the damage that it does to a person's own self, their own feelings, and what they suffer within themselves as a punishment for the sin, and the damage to the emotions, to our own self-worth and self-respect. You as a Christian can help to put back together as you approach them with an attitude of love. Let me say just a couple of things concerning masturbation. I think this is a very difficult problem to deal with, again, and one that we confront. Let me say these things. I'm going to have to condense it, and then we'll have time for maybe a few questions. I think it's important in this problem, number one, to get the facts. How long has the problem been in existence? What type of frequency? Are there any associated problems with it? Fantasizing, books, movies, magazines, this type of thing. It's important to get the facts before any advice is given. I think we need to realize there probably will be different types. One where there's sort of a lust associated with it, obsessive frequency, with perhaps other, with not only fantasy, but with books and pornography associated with it. Some more so release only, for a emotional or sexual release only, no thoughts connected with it, not necessarily that frequent. Other types, such as nocturnal emission, waking up in the act of masturbation, that type of thing that needs to be dealt with. Then, perhaps most common, simply the person who is tempted, who resists, but then ends up giving in and feels terribly guilty and gives in more frequently than they can live with or are comfortable with, perhaps on several times a week or every other week type basis, this type of thing, and it debilitates them as a Christian. Let me mention several things that I say to people who come into me with this problem, and I want to just sort of put this out and let you think about it. I make the statement that the Bible is silent on, as far as I know, on the direct problem of masturbation. I've never found a verse. If you have, and you've seen one that you think that applies, please tell me after class. But I think the Bible is silent on that specific problem. So we'll have to approach it from other means of dealing with it. Number one, the problem of lust the Bible has spoken about. Matthew 5:28, other verses, you know that we should not fantasize this type of thing in our mind. Lust is wrong. Secondly, the Bible has spoken about violating our own conscience and doing things that we ourselves are not comfortable with. Romans 14:23, whatever is not of faith is sin. If a person is having conscience or guilt problems with this, then that in itself, I think, is a problem. Thirdly, anything that masters us as a person. Paul addresses this in 1 Corinthians 6:12, where he says, all things are lawful, but not all things are constructive. And he said, I will not be mastered by anything. A habit of life that is life-dominating and that controls us and dominates us should not be. Fourthly, I think so often what happens in masturbation is something that Ken referred to earlier, in that it leads to self-centeredness in our sexual attitudes and in our life in general. Those are 4 observations that I make on it, which I think are important. I think that there is the person that I've talked with who really has none of these feelings about it. It's more of a simple release and so forth and so on. I think it's so hard to advise on it. And it's hard for me to say, well, here's what you ought to say, in a situation like that. I feel that the person himself is going to have to come to grips with it. If it means nothing to them, it doesn't bother them all, why are they in for counseling? I think perhaps there may be something bothering them about it that needs to be dealt with. So I think in just about all cases, the best thing is for the person to get this out of their life and to deal with it realistically in life, because it can become such a dominating thing as far as conscience and life and habit is concerned. Let me mention these things. I think in dealing with a problem like this, to set short-term goals and to accomplish them is important. That's true of any problem that tends to be a habit-type problem, but setting short-term goals. Secondly, preparing for times when the testing is greater, when the temptation is greater, time of day, under stress, this type of thing. Thirdly, to help a person realize that you do not have to give in to a temptation to be relieved from the pressure of the temptation. That victory tends to increase an attitude of victory about it rather than submission to it to relieve the pressure of the temptation. Fourthly, deal with any conscious thoughts or overt acts that tend to bring upon this problem in life, such as reading the wrong kind of books, materials, that type of thing, or any deliberate thoughts of mind that can be dealt with. Fifthly, all of life must be focused on Christ. Don't just become consumed in a problem like this. It's better to get more involved in serving the Lord, serving others, praying, reading the Bible, and not relating everything in life to dealing with one sin or temptation. I've seen many people that just were consumed with this and other sins in life and therefore couldn't get out of it, because all they were doing was waiting for Satan to launch his next attack on that or any other sin. And of course, you play defense the whole game. No matter how good your defense is, they'll slip through and score. And again, Romans 12:21 to fill up life with good things, and to just get it so involved in being a Christian and serving God that this kind of thing just doesn't have time. What happens when a person slips or falls in this area? To not become consumed, to not go into a tailspin spiritually, to not just crash and burn over a mistake or a problem, but to have the attitude, I'm going to get up and overcome this, and to not get down or depressed or defeated again because I made a mistake and I fell in this area. I don't think, Kim, we're going to have time to cover our other subjects at all, and we don't even have time to take many questions. Maybe we better go ahead and take some questions on some of these things. Maybe you have a question. Okay, Barry.
I was just wondering what you think of using the argument that the Bible says sexual immorality. I've heard it said that would include anything that God has not said is sexual morality, which is sex and marriage. That's a very broad area. It would include homosexuality, adultery. It would include masturbation. It includes that line of thinking. Is anything that God has not, any sexual activity that God has not ordained being right and good, therefore be in that category? I don't know.
Ken, would you care to answer that question?
I think it's deductive reasoning that should be referred to yesterday's sermon.
Deductive reasoning, Ken says. I'd have to think about that, Barry, before I made that conclusion, because what is allowable in the sexual relationship between a man and a woman? Has God told exactly the way to go about that? He has not. That would be my first reaction, although I'd like to think about what you said. I don't want to say too much more on it because I've never thought of it really deeply from that point of view. Yes.
Do you ever counseled anyone with herpes simplex 2?
No, I have not. Have you, Ken?
No.
Have not. Yes, Rick.
I think even in some Christian literature, there's a belief, and it's getting more prevalent, that this is a natural response to some kind of biological rhythm that people go through to masturbate. And Adams does a good job in some of his materials showing that it really is like homosexuality, a learned behavior that can be changed.
I think that we need to, I think the best way I've ever known how to deal with it is to give a person a perspective on the whole biblical view of it, the way that I've done, without saying it's always wrong, it's always right, it's great, it's terrible, it's horrible. Yeah, I think that it's better to let a person see the total picture and deal with it within their own heart and conscience. Usually they came in because they're not comfortable with the situation, and they would rather have it out of their life than in their life. Yes.
Have you counseled many people, girls especially, who have this problem with anorexia or bulimia?
No, I have not. Maybe he better define that. Ken, maybe no.
I refer those cases to our women's counselor. Seriously, I don't want to just pass that off, because that is becoming a tremendous problem. The head of the psychiatric service at Arizona State last fall said that was the number one problem that they were dealing with at the counseling center there. And it's something that, is relatively new to me, something I know not too much about, and probably not many of us do, and probably ought to become educated about it. And, I discovered there are some things you can learn from the shrinks on campus, because this guy had his head on pretty good about how to deal with that and had some good ideas about it.
Let me say this. When you have a person with severe emotional or mental problems, I think if you know of a Christian counselor in town that or in your congregation that could help a person on a continuing basis, I think you may do better, especially if you're in the ministry, to help to advise a person to go to someone like that, because that person may need ongoing attention just for the sake of being able to meet once a week. Perhaps a professional Christian, I would emphasize Christian, in that could help them more than you could, because they could give them more time and attention. Because if you're in the ministry, you know how it is. You may not be able to give them that. I think we better close out here. Perhaps if you want to come and ask some other questions, we've been going an hour now. Thank you very much. I know we only scratched the surface here.